podcast, The Nearly Men, with myself and the beautiful Doug Allen. How you doing, Dougie?
Oh, I'm very well, thanks. How are you, Matt?
Not too bad, mate. 5 days into a new baby. Don't know my arse from next
Mm.
Thursday, but we'll breeze past that one, mate. We've got a special guest on today. I don't know if you've noticed, he's in a box over there,
Yes, I can see
looking a
him.
little
Hi.
bit like Toad of Toad Hall, I think, in that hat. It looks very cool. It's the one and only Paul Woody Woodadge. I do apologize, Woody.
That's fine.
I put a bit of a hiccup in your name there. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. Busy, but always good. Yep.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So we've got you on today because we had a little chat on WhatsApp, broadly, to chat about how Band of Brothers has influenced historians, how they've changed the narrative of how history is now written. Um, I had this. I struggled so much to write this question at the beginning. It was like a page long dialogue. It was so intricate what I was trying to say, and it really reminded me of that Monty Python sketch when it's the sex education class. Just start
Yes.
with a kiss, boy. What's wrong with a kiss? You're leaping in for the clitoris. I went totally overboard. So let's start broadly there. How has history, how it has been written since Band of Brothers has been published, changed in your opinion?
Well, you kind of have to go back to how it was written before, really.
Right.
And obviously, there's literally thousands of books about World War II. I mean, there's over 1,000 biographies of Churchill alone. So it's a subject that has been tapped for 80 years now. But kind of just after the war, you had the very stuffy kind of regimental divisional histories that were a record for those that were there. They didn't try and kind of dwell on the death and the sadness. There wasn't necessarily much in the way of personal stories. It was just, and the division moved out from here to here to here to here to here. And then you had the kind of the memoirs by people who fought there. So it was I did this, obviously not in a kind of a self congratulatory way, but kind of the point of view of a single voice, and then explaining, and then I sent Sergeant Smith to do this, and I sent, Corporal Jones to go and do that kind of thing. And then you had the big sprawling Cornelius Ryan, and later on Max Hastings, John Keegan, Carlo d'Este, Martin Middlebrook kind of books that try to cover huge chunks of the war, or even the entire war in one volume. And with the book that Stephen Ambrose put together, it really was the first study of one unit of men, but not told through the point of an individual, told through the point of view of a unit.
Right.
And then the series did that even more so, because from my point of view, the series tried to say something as well. It wasn't just a record. It was trying to, why we fight was making a statement way beyond just the story of the E Company guys there. It was making a big story about motivation and everything else. And so since then, and it's not just Band of Brothers that's done this, it's just the way history has changed anyway. But now books are often written from the point of view of 20 or 30 guys within one unit. And then later on, we can talk about the fact there's now a generation of people whose very reason for writing history and talking about history at all is because they were 14 and 15 years old when Band of Brothers came out. And they're now in their mid-30s coming up. And they're the ones who are still doing their degrees in history. They're still in their careers, who perhaps haven't written their World War II book yet. But when they come to describe when their World War II book comes out, why did you get into World War II? They will say it was Band of Brothers. So there's lots of layers to this.
Yeah, and I'll drill deeper in lots of different directions, and you've picked up on quite a few things there. But I just wanted to go back to, I mean, I've always been a history nut, always. And it was difficult back in the day, wasn't it? Goodness me, like the amount of times I picked up a book on like Napoleon. Now, how can you write a boring book about Napoleon? It's impossible when I think about it. He's one of the most fascinating and brilliant human beings that ever lived. But you get a big, thick tome about Napoleon, and there's these sweeping battles and marshal this and marshal that and this, and you just can't follow it.
Yep.
And so
that is that's how it is.
Yeah.
Given what I do with my YouTube channel, and I get a lot of books sent to me. I get them either hard copies or PDFs, and most of them are very good. Some of them just aren't. Some of them you're just losing your way because there's too many people. you don't know who they all are. You've lost track of them all. And at its heart, what the TV show did is it, by focusing on individuals and kind of moving them in and out of focus a little bit, because some of you guys were kind of central to all the episodes. Some had you kind of your major episode that was your story, and others were kind of peripheral through the whole thing. But all in all, it created this idea where the audience, the viewer, understood the story through those lenses. You can tell a bigger story through a smaller cast of characters. And now, the historians I work with day to day, and James Holland and Damian Lewis, that's Damian Lewis, author Damian Lewis, not Captain Winter's Damian Lewis.
That does confuse me sometimes.
It does. It confuses him. It confuses everybody. One's with an E, one's with an A. But that way, I mean, look at Rogue Heroes. You must have seen that and thought there's a huge amount of Band of Brothers in the way that story was told.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, honestly, I fell asleep last night reading about Paddy Mayne. I'm obsessed with that show, and I'm obsessed with everybody in it. I can't wait for the new season. I just read all around it. I just think it's unbelievable. But yeah, absolutely. There's very much, it's what you described in our WhatsApp. Is it character-based unit or character-driven unit-based drama?
Yeah. No, exactly. And I don't, I don't know that some of the people writing would necessarily label the way they write as having been influenced by a Band of Brothers, but it's there. It's definitely there in how they have understood the best way to communicate stories, but also just how the audience stroke reader is also getting more out of it as well. I mean, that's the thing, that the conversations about Rogue Heroes I've seen on Twitter and social media have been about the individuals, not so much, was it 16 Italian aircraft they destroyed in this raid, or was that the one where they got 12? Because that, ultimately, that doesn't matter. That's just that's the detail that you kind of need to have in a book, because someone will go, was that the second model of Italian aircraft with a different engine? But the people is where you'll remember the story. The people are how that story resonates with people. And I say that's where, for me, Band of Brothers was a game changer. We always talk about how authentic was it, the boot camp and the attention to detail and uniforms and insignia and vehicles, and of course that it was top notch. And then there was all those 20th anniversary articles that I was reading this morning about it, talking about how much it influenced TV, and it blurred the lines between movies and TV, because people will always include Band of Brothers in their lists of movies when it isn't, is it? But it, in some way, in your mind, it is a movie.
Right.
It's like a set of sequels, isn't it? In a weird way, because it feels like a movie. But that's that's not about the history. That's about the TV impact, which is kind of a separate subject and very interesting.
Yeah, and one I think I'll try and dive into a little while, because I was going to talk about the influence that Eric Jenderson actually had on what we're talking about, which is how historians then viewed it and came back and thought, I should try and attack it from this angle. Because my personal, I'll talk about it in a while. My personal opinion is his influence is absolutely huge in the way that he created that Bible, in the way that he chose certain stories and certain dispatches and talking heads and all that stuff to create everything, and why he chose it in the way that he did. But I just want to make a point, and Doug, you can weigh in on this as well, because when Woody came up with this idea for this chat, for this podcast, one thing jumped out at me as super obvious, and that is people have been writing, whether or not it was World War II, whether it was World War I, whether it was Napoleon, all the rest of it. These historians have been writing these tomes for years, and yet in fiction, in art, you've got, I don't know, like a film like Platoon, you've got Catch-22, you've got Journey's End, you've got all this stuff. Those were all character-driven, unit-based shows. So it was right in front of them the whole time. Do you know what I mean? And it took what, I don't know whether you agree with me here. I feel like with Ambrose's book, it was almost a happy accident. It was the way in which he recorded all these stories and dialogues and put it down, that it sort of just appeared as this kind of talking head screenplay. And it was from that, because I mean, we can talk about the book as well. I mean, what the book came out in 1992. How was it actually received as a book, as a piece of writing, not what it was about?
I think it was a slow burn. I don't think it had it wasn't a book that suddenly everyone was talking about. It was a book that came out along with lots of other military books in that early era, and then later on, it had that second round of fame because of the TV show. But I mean, it was a success. But I mean, one of the interesting things about Ambrose is I've always felt that Ambrose wished he was like a Jack Higgins, Tom Clancy kind of guy. I always feel, I wish that he thinks he wanted to be a fiction writer,
right?
And found the restraints of real people a little bit difficult because you can't change the outcome. You know, if historical fiction, which is another whole branch of if you create a character in that, you as the author can decide whether that character lives or dies. You can decide whether he or she does get the girl, does survive, does find the treasure, whatever it would be. But with Band of Brothers, for example, you may, as you first research the program, you may decide that Hoobler is your favorite character and he's the one you'd like to have to go back home and marry the sweetheart. But Hoobler dies, so you can't change reality. So, you know, and Ambrose got himself into some trouble for kind of making up certain things in various books and exaggerating things. And there's the whole Shifty Powers Patrol story that does the rounds among historians about how he wrote about that. And again, I think that's where I get this idea that I felt Stephen Ambrose almost wished he was writing in he was writing in fiction.
Right.
But that was the connection, wasn't it? It was that kind of, there was a, you know, the way it was written was like an ensemble play already, wasn't it? It was kind of, so I could see it's like coming from the perspective of TV and film, that how that book in particular would interest me, because the story's pretty much written and it has a voice, and you know, you have all these different characters in it that all have different experiences, and you're right, you know, and they're all kind of heroes, you know, so you're going to get, you know, in each separate story with each separate, I mean, it's even talking about them, I want to refer to them as characters.
Yeah.
Not, you know what I mean? You have that sort of sense just kind of reading it, or I did when I read it, that it was, you know, you could see it was kind of made for this crossover. And, you know, it's interesting that you say that he had a bit of trouble in the past for kind of, whether it's fictionalizing a little bit too much, which is a very important line for a historian not to cross, I would imagine. You know, it's a very tight line, and you said that he did that, and that just kind of plays into it for me. It's like, okay, so he was a kind of a film writer, almost like a frustrated film writer who found himself as a historian, and that's why it probably appealed, because it was written in that way. It was kind of begging to be made in a way, wasn't it? Did you get that feeling, Matt, when you read it for the first time?
Yeah, and that's sort of where I got to this sort of the idea that it was almost a happy accident, like the way that it was put down on paper.
Yeah.
Suddenly you look back at it and think, oh my God, it looks like a screenplay. Do you know what I mean? It's got no real sort of like padding around it. And historically, I mean, Woody can answer this question or statement if he wants, but he doesn't seem like he's a very good historian.
Yeah.
But what he has done is he's put
not.
down, yeah, exactly. He's put down all these sort of like dispatches and talking heads. And you look at it and it's like that Mr. Kobayashi moment. It's suddenly, oh my God, this would make a brilliant screenplay.
Yeah.
And in that, it's kind of strange. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read On the Road, Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And I'm doing a parallel in my head, because that's a sort of epoch-making moment in American literature. Suddenly there's a different style of writing, you know, it's this great idea, and you go out and you see America, and everybody thinks about that book as a great piece of literature. It's absolute fucking garbage if you read it. It's one of the worst written books. And I'm not saying that's what Ambrose's book's like, but I think what it spawned is far greater than the idea that he put down.
Yeah. Happy accident. I would agree with that. It was right style of writing to appeal to a particular type of person that works in the film industry. Do you know what I mean? That would use it for the basis for something, because the jump was there to see. You could read it and visualize it in your way, as a filmmaker does. You know, we kind of see in sequences and shots and character arcs and all this kind of stuff, and it was all kind of there. Like history books can be a little bit like academic books that I read in my law studies. You know, they can be very dry.
Yeah,
very
boring me about it. Yeah.
and very fact driven, which is just going from one fact that's corroborated to another, to another, to another. And, you know, it's yeah.
And all
I
you're
feel,
really doing with that is you're turning on the people that Woody alluded to earlier. That's like, like, I'm
mm,
sorry, how many Italian tanks was it? What type of
Yeah.
machine gun is that? That's porn for those guys. But if
I
you're
mean,
trying to
the
get,
happy accident thing, to carry
yeah,
on that, and
yeah,
Doug's
yeah,
absolutely right about that, is that you've got to think about. I know we're talking about the TV show, but the TV show, the book, the phenomena, it's all intrinsically tied together. Is that when Ambrose started writing, he found himself trying to inhabit two worlds. So, on the one hand, he was going and meeting generals. I mean, because he was writing when the generals were around, not when just the privates and corporals. The actual commanders of armies were around. So he would have to circulate at the military functions, the balls, the going to army base, but also he was writing out of kind of a hippie. You see him in the 60s. He looks like a kind of a a dropout from a Crosby, Stills and Nash kind of the Birds concert. He's kind of got long trigger sideburns and a caftan. His hair's a bit kind of like the Monkeys. So he
it's
had to
under a
learn
Southern
how
Cross. Yeah, go.
he had to learn how to inhabit both those worlds, the kind of the military, going in there calling people sir and getting memoirs, but also appealing, because he did a lot of rounds at the university, speaking engagements, book groups and stuff, where Berkeley and places like that, when he was white. So he knew how to straddle those two worlds. And I think, no, you're right, he wasn't the greatest historian, but he was a brilliant writer. I think when he wrote Band of Brothers, whether consciously or subconsciously, he was trying to appeal to that mass readership, and that's what the book did, and that's what the TV show did. Is it's relatively easy to make a documentary about World War II for the people who watch documentaries, because they want that detail. But making a TV show about the war that appeals to a wider audience, and look at the people who have follow you, Matt. That most of the people who were on the tour I did with in June, you wouldn't look at them and say, yeah, military history fan. I think like the great percentage would just be random people, like a kind of a normal sort of a survey group of people who watch TV. That's who you'd find in that tour group. Whereas some of the tour groups I work, they all look like they have military maps in their hand all the time,
on parts of their body.
like me,
Yeah,
really.
Yeah. Judging your every move and every word.
Exactly. Yeah, just
actually correct.
You can imagine sort of chortles and sniggers when you mentioned group. It was a British tank.
Don't get me started on the people who leave the comments on my YouTube channel with I think you're actually I think you're
never
fine.
Read the comments. Never read the comments.
But that at its heart is what Band of Brothers did, and it's not easy to replicate. Look, Fury, for example, and you're bound to end up talking about Fury.
Yeah.
When that was started, as I understand it, they were going to base it on much more on a real story of the second US Second Armored Division confronting this German unit that they kind of met several times. It was based on a book by Mark Bando, in fact. And the American was a tall, good-looking Texan with perfect teeth, and the German had like a messed up face with dueling scars and stuff, or he'd been burnt in a tank. And these two tank commanders met several times. And then during the process of putting the screenplay together, they kind of ditched that idea and went with the fictional version, created the war daddy character, things like that. Because I don't know, I'm saying it because as if I was there at the meetings, but I think the realization was it's really hard, because you're stuck with real characters. If you stick with real characters, you've got to have the outcome that the real characters did. And whereas Band of Brothers, I'm guessing from the screenwriter's point of view, it did have that perfection of some of the major characters going on a massive great arc from beginning to end that are still there at the end, but with a few key characters dropping off through it. It was a happy accident. I mean, that it did have all the ingredients you needed to make a story that had that narrative flow that Band of Brothers did, but not by contriving it. It was there in the genuine experiences from that particular unit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I alluded to it before, a lot of that, the way I was thinking about what you said when you said that, you can't invent these guys' stories, but you can very cleverly, like one of those little things you used to look through when you were a kid that changes the pictures, you can very cleverly edit from one to the other, to the other, to the other, and sort of create a sort of arc in what you actually leave out and then what you jump back to. And that has got to go down. That's got to go down as a piece of genius from the writers who then took it on as screenplays, particularly Eric Jenderson, who we've had on. And I see a lot of him in the whole show. he's a sort of tough, uncompromising man's man guy, and what he chose to put in, I think, makes that narrative work so well.
Mm.
Because the
luck.
permutations must be endless as to how you told that story.
Yeah,
you could have told it one way, you could have told it another, you could have only have had Dick Winters, he could have just been his story the whole time. How they then chose the threads is part of the genius.
But they had the luck of having all that Winters archive of the correspondence going back 3 or 4 decades. That, because military authors, when they're looking at like the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Archive, for example, these are all interviews conducted for a specific purpose of recording that person's testimony. There are people who are very good at interviewing people. Peter Hart, who's an absolute force of nature, has been on my channel. His last book, Footslog, is about the Durham Light Infantry in World War II. It's based on all those interviews he conducted back in the 80s and 90s. But you're still interviewing people under a semi-official, they're in a room, there's a microphone there, whereas a lot of the little details of the interactions came from that correspondence, the Mike Ranney letters, the letters Bull Randleman wrote to I've forgotten the writer, the Shark book died on David Webster. That's just names out that way. But that was from that correspondence where they weren't trying to record history. They were two friends writing back and forth, and Ranney wrote to Webster, and so that would have given Ambrose and then later the writers of the episodes a whole layer that wouldn't have come from conventional military history veteran archives. So they had a huge resource to start with, but then, as you said, Matt, that could make it more difficult, because then how do you boil that down to making those 10 episodes, each one of which is like a masterclass in screenwriting and storytelling? It's the legacy is huge.
Yeah, I agree. So if we switch tack from that a little bit, although the legacy is huge and the historians love it, it is replete from episode 1 to 10 with historical inaccuracies. How do you balance, as a historian, as a tour guide, and doing what you do, the sort of love of what's happening with, I've really got to tell the real story here? Because when we toured together in Normandy, I was like, no, have at it, man. If you want to bust myths, it actually makes it more interesting for me.
Well, it's a weird one, really, because most of the military historians I know, the films they like are the ones that don't purport to be anything factual. The Where Eagles Dare, the Inglourious Bastards, Kenny's Heroes, those Guns of Navarone, where it's a fictional setting within a factual war, and the characters can do what they want. And as soon as you start mentioning the films that purport to be factual, the Bridge Too Fars, the Midways, people start getting a bit, they got that wrong. But Band of Brothers, and I don't know why it is really well regarded by every historian I know, and not just regarded, loved. And yet they know there are these historical inaccuracies. But I think when they come along, and they do come along, they don't interfere with the actual message that's being told. They don't derail the central narrative of this is what a company of men go through when they're fighting. They're I'm not saying they're only like the rivet counter mistakes, because there are some genuine human mistakes, the Blythe, the things like that. The fact, the whole Rose story is probably the most fascinating, because, Roe didn't probably meet Rene Lemaire, but historians would know that episode still manages, despite these mistakes, to convey everything anybody who was trying to write about the Bastogne siege in reality would want to put in a story about the Bastogne siege. And that's the brilliance of it, is that we all just ignore the mistakes because we saw what the result was at the end. And they weren't mistakes, because some were genuine. Most were conscious decisions, I think. Weren't they were, how can we make the Liebgott character have more impact in the scene there? Let's absolutely play on the Jewish card. And there's still debates about whether or not the real Liebgott was Jewish or Catholic, but it doesn't matter. The way the making of him Jewish was the best thing they could have done to make that episode work.
Yeah, I agree. So it's sort of like, it poses a sort of interesting question now that does does history need a little bit of sort of fiction in it to make it interesting?
Yeah. I mean, Damian Lewis, that's again Damian Lewis, author Damian Lewis, when he writes about particularly the SAS,
Yeah.
what he does, and it's some historians don't like this, is if he's got he's talking about an operation where a group of SAS guys are being flown by C-47 from England to Greece, he will add the thoughts of the guy in the aircraft. He'll say, Captain Leach was looking out the window thinking, will I bring the men back home this time? He nervously fumbled at the cigarette paper in his sleeve as he put his cigarette together, and then turned to his men, and he was in, I'm making this up as I go along, but that's the kind of stuff he puts in. Now, he doesn't know that, because that would not have been said in anywhere by that person there. But none of us are going to go, well, that's preposterous. He wouldn't be nervous. Of course he would be nervous. Of course he'd be. So to me, that kind of storytelling makes me feel like I'm there in the aircraft. And I read a lot of history where I'm getting information, but I'm never with them. I'm not invested in it on a personal level. I think
that's what brings it alive.
Matt.
Yeah, that's what brings it alive, though, isn't it? Because everyone's had those thoughts. Everyone knows what it's like to be nervous and things, and it's the interest of what someone's thinking, isn't it? Who's the author of HHHH? Have you read that? Has any of you read that?
No.
Haven't you read that, Matt?
No.
It's a guy that's written. I think some of our listeners might know. I don't have the facts on me, but it's a sort of a Nazi who's based down in Prague, and he's writing a book about factual, like, events of this Nazi general, but he was writing it in like a diary fashion. It's a really great book. So he was writing about his own experiences while writing it, and it kind of brought the book was a huge success because it kind of brought an element of history to life, because the author was kind of writing it in almost like a diary, and about how he felt as he was writing it, the obstacles he faced as he was writing it, how he kind of had all these problems that writers do where they fall out of trust with what they're doing or get frustrated and all this kind of stuff. But any of those kind of human, basically it just sounds like, the writers, all you have is just added humanity to it. And then that's the link with the audience. They get drawn in by that, and then they feel, like you said, it made you like feel like you were there more.
And I now have the answer to your last question, Matt. The reason historians overlook the errors in Band of Brothers is they were personally invested in it when they watched it. That's right. Whereas Battle of the Bulge with Robert Shaw and and Henry Fonda back, you're not invested in it because it is just so terrible. You don't feel like it's like you never judge a kid knows bad painting harshly because it's a kid you love. It comes in with some awful daubing and you go, yeah, it's brilliant, kid. And I'm not comparing Band of Brothers to a bad child's drawing, but the thing is, there's a serious point about what I'm saying is that the historians are invested in Band of Brothers. It did move them, and that's the thing, and that's why we allow it to have these mistakes, because we are invested in it, we care about it. And I'm not just speaking for me, I'm speaking for the many historians I speak to all the time who just love Band of Brothers. And the Pacific is starting to grow in people's affection as well, though it was a much harder buy into because it's just so violent and frenetic and difficult to embrace, whereas Band of Brothers does have sweet moments in it, which the Pacific doesn't have many of. So Band of Brothers just I don't think it'll ever be repeated in terms of how much influence it had. It was the perfect storm of right timing and the veterans speak at the beginning, and it's going to be universally loved by historians. And I say, getting back to that point about the generation who are now historians because of it. I mean, I was influenced by the war films when I was a kid, but for me it was more comics and warlord comics and battle and commando library and stuff. But I could list people. Well, I mean, I wrote some names down. These are people who are writing now: James Jeffries, Adam Berry, Jonathan Ware, Alina Novobilska, Alex Churchill. They're all historians in their mid-30s who were teenagers when it came out, and they would pretty much say that is the reason I am studying and writing about World War II. Is Band of Brothers hit me at the time when I was in your mid-teens. Is that when you're most like a sponge for that's when you like your first favorite album and stuff, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah. 15, 16, stuff like that. Yeah, 17.
Let me ask you a question. Would it have had the same effect if it was cast, if the cast was filled by famous TV and movie stars?
Yeah, no, it wouldn't have done, would it? No, I was literally having that conversation at the pub with Jimmy Madio last week. We went 2 nights I had with Jimmy, and we literally went through that conversation there, saying that was an absolute masterstroke. Is that no one was really known, and if they were known, they were known for something so completely different. The David Schwimmer thing, you know, that you kind of, it was such an off the wall in a sense. You kind of just had to kind of invest in it. And what was it? Donnie Wahlberg, I guess, was known, but again, from something from different. Done some acting, but he wasn't really known. I think if it had been full of A-listers, I don't know. I don't think it'd have worked.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Because sometimes some actors you can really believe them in their characters, but other actors like George Clooney will only ever play George Clooney.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because he's so much of a movie star, you can't really focus on anything else. And if I watch him, I expect to be charmed.
Yeah. There is another thing I was thinking about as well with the casting, and I don't want to piss anybody off here, but if you watch The Pacific, particularly the first episode, brilliant as all those actors are, and they are freaking brilliant, particularly Josh Bouton. I love Josh Bouton. They all look too contemporary to me. Just physically, they all look too contemporary. A lot of them are really quite beefy, kind of muscular, and their teeth are perfect. And I watch it and I think, I don't believe these guys are, farm boys and stuff from the Great Depression. Not one bit.
Well, that's why The Thin Red Line didn't work for me. You're meant to be having these kind of hick kids in the middle of nowhere, but the narration, they're all sounding like Ernest Hemingway. I'm thinking, that's not how kids sound
Burke,
like. I mean, although some people love it, but you're right about, going back about the book.
Yeah.
I think the great benefit is that the book had only really been read by people who read military histories. So I don't even know if I think I had read the book before the TV show came out. I don't know. I can't honestly remember. But I think because I would say 95% of people who watched Band of Brothers the first time had no idea who any of the characters were or the actors who played them. And that means, of course, you didn't know who was going to live and die. Whereas, like, if those modern movies where there's like 3 principal members of a cast, and there's a 4th person who's a big star, but they don't appear in it till halfway. They're going to be the baddie. They're going to. They wouldn't be 4th listed unless they have a real impact on the plot. So you kind of with certain actors they're not going to die. They're not going to die because. Or if they are going to die, it's going to be at the end of the John Wick 4. Spoiler alert, folks. Keanu Reeves does die, but he's not going to die in John Wick 1, 2, or 3 because it's Keanu Reeves. But we didn't know watching Band of Brothers whether Bill Garnier or Winters or Nixon or Town, but we didn't know who was going to live or die. Which meant that when those that we had fallen in love with did die, that just heightened the emotional investment of it. And whereas if we'd had, I mean, who would have been a massive star in 2000? Leonardo DiCaprio, maybe?
Yeah.
You'd have known he'd have been cast in a role that would make it all the way through, wouldn't you? If he was playing Winters, and that wouldn't have worked just on many levels, but if we'd have all known he must make it through to episode 10.
Yeah. I was just finding this book that I was sort of quoting. It's called Himmler's Heist Heydrich, HHHH, and it was written so it's a factual piece. It's a historical piece. So it's about Reinhard Heydrich, who was Himmler's man in Prague, and there's an assassination attempt by 2 Czechs on him with a briefcase bomb or something.
Yeah.
But it's written, but they're saying that what it's done to the historical novel. I was just reading just some summaries and reviews on it. Is that it's a historical piece, but they refer to it as a novel. So he's done what you've been saying, Paul. He's kind of recreated moments and ad-libbed the dialogue around it and the feelings and emotions around a historical event. And therefore that book, HHHH, became like a huge seller. Like, instead of just selling to the community that reads historical books, it actually found its way into people that read fiction as well. And it's a really, really, really good book to read. But it's the same kind of principle, which, yeah, takes a historic event and just adds the human to it.
Mm.
You know, when you're looking back and looking from, you know, reports on this and that, and, you know, you're just collating facts. You're being a lawyer, essentially.
Yeah,
That's what you are. You're being a lawyer. You're building a case for the person you're writing about. That's it. It's a very dry experience, but it focuses on a huge amount of detail, historical, accurate detail. But then it won't have anything in it about, you know, how the person's feeling at the time. And I think once you open that, then you're opening up the viewer to, you know, and, you know, like you say, if any of those faces had been famous, then you would just focus on the famous face. You wouldn't be listening. I think because no one knew who anyone was, you just followed the story. You followed the dialogue. You followed what was happening within the background. This brevity that is already be sitting in you, because you know it's based. You know these guys really lived. You know.
but as you said at the beginning, Matt, you know, you had the Bible, you had all that work, and I've got copies of that as well. You had these; they weren't just character thumbnails. In some cases, it was, you know, just reams of stuff you had about it, which you'd all spent, depending on how much you knew about your particular character, as much time as you could on. So you'd already created way more than a thumbnail sketch. I'm sure there's jobs you've done as actors where, you know, kind of get told who the character is in the morning and the filming starts in the afternoon, and you've got to just work with that, you know, or if you're lucky. But you had that depth of stuff to go into, which was based on, let's say, not only Ambrose's work, but also the correspondence from Winters, the interaction these guys had had over the reunions for years, so that you, as a viewer, and I mean as a viewer, whether you're just a regular viewer or a historian viewer, you were able to invest in Muck and Penkala very quickly, and Lars and all those other guys, through really not that much on-screen character development, but it was there. It was somehow there, and it was the way you guys, because, you know, we're going to repeat all the boot camp stuff, but you guys were interacting in character before the cameras even started rolling, weren't you? So you'd built up that, who the pairs were, who the Bonds were, who the Mortar guys were. And that all just came through on screen. And I said, again, I'll repeat myself. That's why historians will give it a huge amount, cut it a lot of slack on the historical inaccuracies, because they just, as a piece of, as a character study, as a way of getting across. I mean, it's why Alina, Leighton, who's, you know, part of this, Leighton met Alina Novobilska at We Have Ways a couple of weeks ago. And Alina is a Holocaust historian. And she absolutely gushed the first time she met Ross McCall online, because that is, the concentration camp elements of Band of Brothers, she says are about the most effective way ever of getting across the Holocaust in a few minutes to people who don't understand the Holocaust. Not Schindler's List, not some of the books, but just some of those scenes there. And that is incredible for a TV show to have had that kind of impact on serious scholars who are now going out there. And Alina is in it just an incredible force of nature who's out. If you think, when I think my life is bad, to be a Holocaust historian, you're dealing with horrible murders on a daily basis, and you've got to somehow find the mental strength to go out there and keep telling people these horrific events. Because if you don't keep telling people these horrific events, people will start to, you know, believe all this Holocaust denial bullshit that goes around. And so that influence Band had is extraordinary. You know, to be recognized as a serious contributor to Holocaust memoir for a show you all did 22 years ago now is insane.
Yeah, I agree. And there was something that sort of popped into my head where you guys were talking as well. And I don't know whether you agree with me on this, but when we're talking about the way that the show was put out, and how it's more of sort of this sort of like unit-based, character-based stuff now, it blows away that sort of snobby academic crap as well that's attached to sort of ye olde history, and it's more of a grunt's eye view.
Yeah.
And I'm stealing that from Paul Sanchez, who did the Platoon documentary. He wanted to be what he called a grunt's eye view. And I think it's that sucks a lot of people in as well. It's like you watch it and you think, I know that dude. Nobody knows a general.
Yeah.
Nobody knows some guy who was brought up as a lord and is suddenly a general and has got 400,000 men under his command. But they know some smart Alec radio guy who's always got a ciggy coming out of his mouth and,
Yeah.
like Luz or whatever. You know these people. It's like, I know that dude. And it's that sort of grunt's eye view way that it was told as well. I think is very seductive to people and draws you in. And again, you can be like, well, the historical inaccuracies are, well, we'll let that go because the characters of the people are so engaging.
Yeah, and you're right there, Matt, because going back to how I explained what type of history is written and what type of areas are covered, it's now perfectly legitimate to be a military historian and not have to put in all the context of, and the war started in 1939, there were 6 fronts on the Eastern Front, and each one is commanded by a field marshal that involves this and breaking down. You can just take people straight into the action.
Right.
And not cover that context, because as long as you leave resources explaining where that context is, if people want it, but you can just start in Pavlov's house in Stalingrad with the defensive perimeter by 100 or so Soviet soldiers, with a little kind of across the river single position with Germans all around them. You can just tell it from that point of view, because the minute you start going into what the generals are doing, you lose most of the people. And that was another masterstroke about Band of Brothers, is not having the scenes of too many generals standing around maps going, and this is the plan for 7th Army to do this and 8th Army, because that only has a limited amount of interest. And also there's no way of you just get into those conversations, which I like having because I'm a geeky military historian, about which general was at fault for this operation. But there's never any conclusions to those, because everyone has an opinion, and opinions like ourselves, everybody has one. So what does it matter? But as you said, Matt, and Doug as well, is that what ultimately keeps people going. The reason I watch football is not to debate which formation he should have switched to in the 60th minute. It's that player who gets you to stand on your feet because you don't know what he's going to do with it. Oh my God, he's going to do something. And I think that's, at its heart, is the scenes when Lars is running about in the strike there, and which foxholes you're going to run to. That is telling more about war without actually explaining anything about the battle than 2 chapters about, and what the Germans are trying to do is reach this road junction here because there they can strike left and right. That's fine, that conversation, but that sequence there about how individuals are caught like rabbits in the headlights in the middle of an earth-shattering barrage, and where do you go, is ultimately really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely agree. So I'll just switch tack again a little bit. So how has Band of Brothers, how long have you been guiding for in Normandy?
22 years. So basically, I started. I moved to Normandy the week Band of Brothers aired.
Very good.
So my guiding career is exactly the same length as Band of Brothers, but by complete random, just chance.
Wow.
And how has Band of Brothers influenced your guiding and guiding style? I know when we were in Normandy on the tour, you and you don't need to talk about this, there are certain folk that say this is a Band of Brothers tour, so let's talk Band of Brothers, which I think is a bit silly. But how has it influenced you and other guides? Is it more now that you are just talking small units, small characters in your stories and telling the bigger picture that way, rather than the huge attack on Pointe de Hoc or whatever? You're picking out certain characters.
I mean, there's 150 of us in Normandy guiding, and I don't do as much guiding as I used to. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. But yes, I mean, characters and personal stories are ultimately memories you will leave with people, more than, again, explaining that 7th Corps took the left flank and 8th Corps took the right flank. And some people want that as well. That it's about, as a guide, you have to adapt what you're doing to the audience. That's the difference between perhaps maybe an intimate theatre, probably improvisation. You kind of go as actors the way the audience is going, but you've got to play to a general audience. A good guide will play to the audience they've got that day. So a tour I did with the We Happy Few tour will be different to a tour I might do a week later, because it's an entirely different set of people wanting something very different out of it. But But Band of Brothers was hugely influential. It's hugely influential in the way that tours are planned, because so many big companies now have a Band of Brothers tour that in some cases are what I would call a proper hands-on Band of Brothers tour, where they are going. This is where the bit of rock Lipton was behind, and over there is where, and others are using it as a means of explaining the Battle of Normandy and the Battle of Europe through the lens of a popular TV show to kind of bring people in and use it to kind of punctuate the narrative. But there's no standard way of doing it. I mean, I've had kind of a love-hate relationship with it, because I started doing Band of Brothers tours myself and loved going out there and explaining the times I had spent in Normandy with Bill Gardner and Don Malarkey. And then I got to the point where I was starting to get a bit frustrated with it, because people didn't want to spread out from it. They would like, I don't care about that. And I'm like, but you have to understand this to make this work. I was trying to put in what the TV show didn't do. Carrington, as you know, Matt, Easy Company did that, were at the vanguard of that final punch that came in on the 12th of June and helped and really tipped the balance in Carrington. But to get to that point, to get to episode 3, you have to have done episode 1 and 2. And in the Carrington story, episode 1 and 2 are the 502nd coming down Purple Heart Lane, the 327th glider coming in down the canal. And so when I would try and put those things in, sometimes, mostly people were like, I'm glad you gave that context, because now that scene in Band of Brothers has more meaning, because I understand what happened before. Some people have actually said to me, no, you need to be talking about Dick Winters. I paid for a Band of Brothers tour. I don't want to hear about these guys. I've had that happen to me, and that just used to make me really frustrated, as you can imagine, you know?
Yeah.
I understand as well, I can't remember who told me this. Could have been your buddy Colin, but I don't think so. That you were one of the first guys to actually bring sort of the characters to life by having the photographs and everything as well when you guided.
So I guess I started doing that. I started having an A4 printout of individuals' faces. I think that really helped.
It really does.
I mean, my I have a kind of it's like I'm overblowing it now, but I kind of have a mantra, if you like. There's 3 different levels of information about a site. So Pegasus Bridge, for example, you've got to get across the continent. You've got to get across it. It's the only crossing point at the Caen Canal between Caen and the coast, and it's integral to holding the east flank of the invasion. You've got to get that across, but you can do it as quickly as that. Level 3 is, who was the guy piloting that glider? What was he feeling? What happened to him? How terrified was he? Did he see his best friend die? And I try and put as much of that in the story as I possibly can. And number 2 is a detail. Number 2 is how long was the glider? Which aircraft did it take off? Or how many hours was it flying? How many rounds of ammunition do they have? Now, you need to know as much of level 2 as possible to answer questions, but you don't want to put it in the tour unless you really have to. It's context, and then what were the people going through? And again, that ties neatly into Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers has the context of, this is D-Day, folks. We're going there. Nixon doing the briefing at the airfield. This is why we're going there. This is what we're doing. But kind of away from that really quickly. And now let's follow boots on the ground and miss out the detail. They didn't go into the sticks of there could have been a really clunky narration at the beginning of episode 2 saying, and here's what happened to the various sticks of E Company 506. Several of them landed near here, and they made their movements north on this trajectory. We'd have all got bored.
Yeah. And I guess your level 2 is the bit that you manipulate when you're the stand-up comedian or whatever, and you're gauging your audience. How much level 2?
How much to put in? Yeah. And you can kind of use it ironically. You kind of you throw in facts just to go. But every tour guide's had that moment where you're in. I mean, particularly, it happened to me twice. This happened to me, different occasions, where I'm talking about a twin on Omaha Beach who lost his twin, and how he's writing a poem about it. And actually, Peter Youngblood Hill, Shifty, recorded the poem for me in his lovely Virginia accent, because these guys were from Virginia. And I'm literally playing the audio file of Peter reading this letter about the last line of which is, if you have ever you have a twin, don't go to the war with him. That's the last line. And this guy, halfway through the poem, twice this happened, said, what caliber was the gun that hit his landing craft? You just want to go, fuck you. This is not the moment I'm bringing you to. I'm trying to tell you what it's like, but to experience the loss of someone you've spent your entire life with and how you'll never be the same again. And you're now asking the question about what caliber the gun was? Then you blame yourself. Somehow you've not created the right environment. And I can think that was my performance. That wasn't him. It was me. I didn't get the right. But those moments are really, really tough.
There's not a lot of words that rhyme with caliber either, so you can maybe tell them that next time.
Yeah.
I think that's beautifully rounding things up, Woody. I think we've come back to the emotional investment. Woody, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, buddy.
Cheers.
Hopefully we'll hang out again soon in Normandy. We'd love to get you back on this as well. Thanks for your time, buddy. It's been great.
That's been good. I like talking about it, and I said the influence is there, and it's understandable that now 20 years on we can look back and see that it has left this mark beyond just being a great TV show. It has affected how history is being conveyed to people.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, buddy.
Cheers.
We'll see you again. If you jump off, I'll just round up for the day. Thank you so much for your time, buddy.
See you then. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers, buddy.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, that's pretty good.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I've never really given much thought to how it's kind of changed how history is conveyed. Because, like I say, very similar to you, like whenever I've read history books, they're fact heavy, they're date heavy, they're time heavy, but they're not. There's some kind of invisible sort of barrier between you feeling it beyond anything other than,
and that's obviously just the characters and the real people. Because like I said when we were talking to Woody, the amount of times I've gotten hold of a book on a subject I'm fascinated by, such as Napoleon or Mozart or something like that, and got 4 pages into it and thought, I'm going to die of boredom. I'm going to die of boredom. There's only so many sweeping facts that I can absorb. I'm bored.
But do you think that it's obviously influenced ways of conveying World War II, but do you see the influence has gone further than that as well?
Within history, I imagine so. I imagine so. Yeah, the way that people are sort of writing stories. Well, he mentioned Rogue Heroes, didn't he? So I mean,
that's right. Yeah, HHHH. You should really give that a read.
Yeah,
that's probably another kind of level of it where the writer brings himself a little bit more into the picture as well.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And you wonder where it goes. Do you reckon anyone would ever watch if there was a kind of a German band of brothers on some Panzer division or something, or some airborne division?
Would. I just think it treads a very dodgy line. Do you know what I mean? That people don't ever want to be glamorizing the war. There is a show called Generation War, a German show called Generation War. I think it's either 3 or 4 parts, and it follows a bunch of friends from the inception of the war and a couple of brothers that go off and fight on the Eastern Front, and that is friggin' brilliant.
Is it?
Yeah. That does not shy away. One of them ends up like part of the Einsatz group, just like murdering partisans all the way across Eastern Europe. It's freaking brilliant. But what would be cool is if they actually did one of just like a Wehrmacht division, that didn't have any SS elements, didn't create any murders or anything like that, and just fought. It would be really interesting.
Because obviously they still have Das Boot, in the very. Do you remember when the first season came out? Back in 1981 or 82.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched it when I was a kid with my dad, and that had a huge effect on me because of the realism.
Yeah.
And again, it was a fictional account of a factual, story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I just think that there's. Yeah, and that still can continue, obviously, but it's it's quite. It will be. I wonder if it will be because have you seen that film? Was it the Western Front? The German World War I film.
All Quiet on the Western Front. Yeah, I was going to mention that as one of the.
Yeah. I find again it's kind of hard going, and it's I've watched it once, but it's one of those films because it's. Subtitled, you need to watch it a couple of times before you really kind of get into it. But
it's a weird one, All Quiet on the Western Front, because actually it's one of my favorite books. I think I've read the book about 5 times, and the show itself isn't All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a pretty incredible, visually stunning, sweeping movie, but it's not All Quiet on the Western Front. I mean, a lot of it, I'm like, where's All Quiet on the Western Front as a book is way, way smaller. It is way more sort of like sort of Band of Brothers. You really get to know the characters, and when certain guys die, you're freaking heartbroken. And you don't get that from that film. I think it's way too big and broad, and the battles are incredible and brutal and horrible. But I don't think you get that engagement that you do from the book. The book is incredible. It's a brilliant bit of writing. There's a scene where the lead character, I believe his name's Paul Baumer, goes to visit a guy who's dying that nobody likes. Ostensibly, I might be getting this wrong, he goes because he's waiting for him to die so he can steal his boots.
Right.
And the description of him dying, this guy, is absolutely breathtaking.
Wow.
He describes how his teeth suddenly turn to chalk and the skeleton in his face starts moving forward. Like the skeletons, it just is absolutely breathless piece of writing. And for me, none of that was in the film. I mean, I don't know how you bring that particular bit to life, but I felt it was way too broad. And when I saw it was going to be on Netflix, I was like, I hope they don't try and make it to this huge sort of sweeping Private Ryan, massive battle type of stuff. But then Private Ryan which is exactly what they did. And it's a real shame because it is an incredible story. Beautiful piece of writing there.
Interesting. Yeah.
Any road up, as they say.
So, how's the baby?
Baby's good, lad. Baby's good. Baby's small. He's like a little bug. Beautiful little bug. Yeah.
How much did she weigh when she was born?
It's a he. He weighed 8 pounds.
8 pounds?
Yeah.
That's big.
It's pretty big, yeah.
How much did you weigh when you were born?
Don't know, but my other two kids were like 7 pounds something or other, and this one was 8 pounds.
Oh, right. So what is he, cleaning out the guttering and,
Yeah, I've got him on a demo. We're doing some demo. That's why I've been covered in soot. He's on the demo with me tomorrow. Hopefully his little lungs are going to stand that because there's a lot of soot in the roof. It's like a 100-year-old house taking down. There's a lot of crap. So, yeah, he's going to be paying his own way.
Yeah, that's good. That's important, I think.
It's important. Got him on the demo tomorrow. Yeah, no, he's
5
great.
days is enough. 5 days is enough.
Come on, Mr. Kushti. Pay your way. No, he's great. Thanks for asking. And the wife's great too. She's settling down now, so it's all good. It's all good. All beautiful.
Is that your lot? You reckon you'll have any more?
Oh, yes, that is my lot. That is my lot. Because now I've got 2 boys and a girl. My wife was like, "You'll be really nice if Betty had a sister." I was like, "Yeah, I'm about to go and geld myself with 2 bricks. I'll be honest with you." No, I'll say that we'll probably be having a podcast in a year's time. And I'm gonna have a little girl there.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice work, you idiot.
So have you had sleepless nights already? 4 hourly feeds and all that?
Yeah, a little bit. He's actually sleeps really well. I don't even want to say this out loud because the amount of people I've met who've only got 1 kid. Yeah. And they have this baby and they're like, "Oh my God, he's just wonderful. He sleeps through the night. It's just going to be like, it's just so wonderful. Like kids are just great. Why? I love kids. I'm babies. Oh my God, my babies." And then you don't see them for a year after that because they just disappear into this hellhole of sleepless horribleness. I was like, never say it out loud. So we'll end up paying the piper, but he's been a good boy at the moment.
Yeah, good stuff. But you've been watching the rugby as well.
Yes, mate. That is
not why... great. I watched all I watched was the Band of Brothers WhatsApp group.
Yeah, they were having it last night, weren't they? For that game, the Ireland South Africa game was absolutely brutal.
Was it?
Tonight's Wales Australia, which I'm heavily invested in as my dad's Welsh. So I'm a Welsh rugby fan. It's going to be good stuff. I'll watch it with my little bug of a kid on top of me and pretend I'm parenting.
Lovely.
All right, we'll say thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks to our Patreons. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to Woody. Thanks to the beautiful Doug Allen. And we shall see you again next week. If I haven't had some type of psychotic event from lack of sleep, then I'm not in a nut ward somewhere, then I'll definitely be here. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.